I mean, it is a well-known fact that Edith recruited Kim Philby, or helped to recruit Kim Philby. She passed on his name to Arnold Deutsch, and famously, as the story goes, took him to the park bench in Regent's Park in late spring of 1934 and introduced him to Otto. That was the code name of Arnold Deutsch.
This is the Spy Masters podcast, and I'm your host, Paul Burke. Listen for all things spy-related, fact and fiction. And today's topic is A Woman Named Edith, a new biography of Edith Tudor Hart, émigré, photographer, and secret agent. Daria Santini, a former lecturer in German language and literature at Oxford University, has used the latest research to produce a fascinating biography, a rounded biography of a woman. Most of us know tangentially through her connection to the Cambridge Spies. But as you'll discover, Edith Tudor Hart's story is remarkable in its own right. Daria, hello and welcome to Spy Masters.
Hello, thank you for having me on Spy Masters.
Lovely, and it's really interesting because we're going to be chatting about your book, A Woman Named Edith. I wanted to start just with a general bit of background, if you don't mind. It's always nice to know about people a little bit. And you were an academic at Oxford University. You taught German languages and literature for a long time. Is that right?
Yes, it is. I'm Italian, studied German in Italy, then moved to England and ended up teaching at Oxford for about 15 years.
Right. Because I did notice that an earlier book of yours was The Exiles.
Yes.
Actors, artists and writers who fled the Nazis for London. So the general theme of emigres is something that obviously interests you anyway.
Yes, absolutely. That's where the idea of writing a book about Edith Tudor Hart started.
I did wonder.
The Exiles has a chapter about German and Austrian and Hungarian photographers who came to London in the 1930s. And so her story was so interesting that I picked it up again. But yes, exile and displacement, it's something that interests me for several reasons. I mean, that period of German literature and culture I find very interesting, very relevant. And what fascinated me at the time of writing The Exiles was to what extent these emigres, mainly political emigres, or because they were Jewish, people who came to London after 1933, how they shaped British culture in many ways, in ways that we've perhaps forgotten. But photography was certainly one of those aspects of Central European culture that really influenced.
No, I think you're right. Absolutely. I think we have an awful lot to be grateful for. I mean, our publishing industry wouldn't be half what it is if it wasn't for the immigrants who came over at that time,
That's right. Yes. And one other chapter, for example, was about art historian, the Warburg Institute in Bloomsbury. That was an exiled library, library that was sort of smuggled into Britain in 1933. And with several librarians and art historians that transformed art history in this country. Yes, so that was a book, with various examples, also actors who became famous on the London stage, for example, German actors. And there was something that I could easily reconnect to Edith Tudor Hart and to her photography. There was a sort of attention to life, to real life, a sort of realism and vividness in their style of acting, in their photographs, that was not so present in British culture. British culture was, at this time, was quite insular, quite monocultural, whereas the Central Europeans had, Eastern European influences and Russian and German and Austrian. It was a different world.
Yes. Well, no, I can imagine. Yeah. And the more I think about it, I mean, of course, they also influenced the American culture too, because if you look at Hollywood, the realism in Hollywood movies, all of that comes from Europe, doesn't it?
Yes, if anything, they were probably more influential in America. There
Mm.
is um, Weimar in Hollywood is perhaps more well known than what the Germans did here. But they were certainly very influential, not just in the arts, but also if you think of psychoanalysis or
Yes, of course.
physics and so on,
Yeah.
even sciences.
Which is something I think we might get into a little bit more as we actually talk specifically about Edith's
Yes,
experience and
yes.
where she comes from.
Mm.
One question about that, though, you did mention it comes from the book, and I could imagine that was where it would come from. But your actual interest in Edith, what was it that sort of really attracted you to her then? And you thought, you know what, it's worth telling Edith's life story.
Well, it was both sides of her life. On the one hand, this the fact that she was a wonderful, really photographer. Quite her images are really quite arresting,
Hmm.
but also her extraordinary life as a secret agent, as a Soviet agent, and the fact that. I mean, when I started working on it, just the first time I interviewed Edith's brother, Wolfgang Suschitsky, who was
Hmm.
also a great photographer and filmmaker, it was 12 years ago.
Right.
Didn't I was writing about them both in the one chapter in the Exiles,
Yes.
and I'd gone to ask, to interview him about his life, about him as a photographer, and about his sister, but I didn't know very much about his sister. And during this interview, I became more and more interested about her. I knew a little
Right.
bit about her being a communist and a suspected Soviet agent, but I
Yes.
didn't know very much. So I asked him, and he didn't really want to talk about it,
Mm.
about this aspect, about the politics. He uh, said that she influenced him as a photographer. He described her very intense personality, her generosity, her appearance, a wide circle of friends. But the politics was something he didn't want to get into. And so afterwards, I started working on it a little more. And at the same time, I also remembered one of her photographs hanging in his sitting room where we were sitting. So it was the whole atmosphere around her of this, certainly someone who was very talented,
Hmm.
very charismatic, and very determined, but also with a secret, with a great secret that really not many people had cracked at that stage. Afterwards, great nephew Peter Stefan Jung published a book about her and a documentary which is called Tracking Edith,
Hmm.
and that sort of traces her career as an agent. So after that, I learned a little bit more, but it was still not enough.
No, I can imagine. And what we get actually in your book is a very rounded portrait of the woman as a whole, all
Mm,
aspects of her life rather than just this one thing. I can see somebody living through it like her brother and not wanting to revisit some of those times, that you can see that.
yes,
But the other thing, I suppose, as well is everybody wanted a sensational story. And the
that's
spy
right.
aspect, is
Yes.
obviously that. So I can see why people are a little bit cagey about that. That research process, I mean, what was it like finding stuff on Edith?
It was at first difficult. What I had at first were the MI5 files at the National Archives
Right?
in Kew here in London. They'd been released in 2015 and sort of five thick folders. She'd been shadowed all her life, more or less,
Yes.
from 1930 until her death in 1973. I don't think there was one year where she wasn't followed by somebody. So there was a lot there, and that's also where the few remaining letters are kept, copies of some of her letters, because otherwise there wasn't really anything. She was incredibly secretive.
Yes.
She'd been well trained by the Russians, and subterfuge was something that she really practiced. So there was that. And then I went to see her photographic archive, thousands of photographs, which are now kept at Fotohof in Salzburg. That's our archive. And then there were books, a few books. There's a very important catalogue from an exhibition in 2013 that went to Vienna and was shown in Edinburgh, curated by Duncan Forbes. And the catalogue was really very comprehensive. So it sort of traced quite a lot about her life and her work as a photographer, and a little bit about her politics. But again, all that was not enough. So I went to Vienna. I went to look at Viennese archives, the archive of political resistance, and also the Vienna City Archive, where I found a copy of the report of her arrest in Vienna in 1933.
Yes, right.
For clandestine activity. And that was the first time I really found her, I think, as a person, because there were descriptions of how she was dressed. There were various forms that she had signed. And then there was the content of her bag when she had been arrested for smuggling clandestine letters in Vienna. The police took her bag and then afterwards went to her parents' flats where she was living, and so rummaged through her room. And a lot of the objects that they found were in this report, including sort of collages that she'd made of I don't know, Lenin
Right.
with his fist raised, and her translation of a biography of Lenin, bus tickets, and little sort of
Just little
details
insights
about.
into life that give you a
Yes,
sense of the person.
that's right. Also, the sense of a very, I mean, active is really an understatement. She was so full of energy and she did so
Yeah.
much, both as a photographer. She was translating, she was working very intensely for the Austrian Communist Party at that time. And secretly, several times a week, she would go into a certain bookshop to collect secret material under a false name. And the other thing that struck me then, and then I discovered it was really an element of her whole life, is how many people she knew, how well connected she was. And I think that explains why she was so trusted by the secret arm of the British Communist Party when she came here, and by the Russians for so long.
Yeah, no, that does make a lot of sense. And actually, if anybody's in doubt by the time we finish this about how hardworking and how much this woman actually achieved, then they haven't been paying attention. So let's start at the beginning then. Edith Zwitzky, who was born in 1908 in
Yeah.
Vienna. Well, take it from there. Tell us a little bit about her family background, this social democrat family background, the area itself, Favoriten,
Yes.
and how she develops there.
Her family and her childhood and her early youth really are. I could only write a chapter about them, but done a lot more if I'd had the time and
Right.
the pages, because it is such an extraordinary family background. I mean, she came from a secular Jewish family. They were middle class. They were very cultured. Her father and her uncle had opened the first socialist bookshop in a very poor area of Vienna called Favoriten. It was a very large working class area at the beginning of the 20th century, 1901. And they were really very enlightened people. They also had a publishing house, as well as the bookshop, a lending library. They were publishing poetry, novels, a lot of literature about social justice. But also they were publishing, for example, educational pamphlets for the proletariat, for the working people of their city. And they were very, very active, also very well connected in the social democratic circles of Vienna. And it was not only that, I mean, the whole family was involved in enlightened progressive activities. Edith's aunt, Olga Sushitsky, had a modern dance, a school of modern dance, and she taught the girls of the area. Again, it was a very poor district of Vienna, so it was quite unusual to have, a progressive dance school, a socialist bookshop. And what is interesting, and I think this is perhaps the root of Edith's political engagement throughout her life, was that this family was persecuted for their political views, because it is true that after the end of the First World War, Vienna became Red Vienna, so the Social Democrats were a very powerful force in Vienna, and they did, they built those wonderful social housing estate and so on.
Yes.
But what one should not forget is what is called Black Vienna, that is the sort of conservative. The party was called the Christian Social Party. It was intensely Catholic, intensely sort of reactionary force.
And becomes
And
increasingly
crucially,
reactionary as time goes on in that decade after the war.
yes, very true. And anti-Semitic.
Mm,
So the bookshop, even before the First World War, the brothers Sushitsky, were persecuted on a regular basis for publishing what was called, pornographic material, or
mm,
which was perhaps, a poem by Goethe.
yeah.
Or Marxist literature. So they were taken to court, they had to pay fines. And I think throughout Edith's childhood, the family went through several of these crises, related to this sort of persecution, despite the fact that they were very well connected left-wing um, uh, middle class people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we get a sense of the Vienna at the time as well. I mean,
Mm,
you talked about emigres already. We talked about psychology. This is the city known for the psychology, the founding of the modern psychology.
yes.
There was a lot of art going on at the time as well, and a city very much influenced by the politics. So,
Yeah.
talking about that left wing politics, that move, how did she move into communism?
I think I could not find a sort of definitive proof of
Not the
this.
silver bullet,
But I
no.
think, yes, I think this started at a Montessori nursery where Edith
Right.
taught when she was about, I think, 16 years old. She started teaching there. Again, this was another very enlightened place. She was surrounded by women. It was mostly women who were exceptional teachers. They were interested in psychology, in
Mm,
child psychology. It was the same circle Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna, um, frequented, Anna Freud, who then Edith met again in London. They were really very progressive young women. I mean, she was incredibly young, 16. She
mm,
started working at this revolutionary Montessori nursery. And then she came to London and studied with Maria Montessori herself. But in this nursery, I think both her interest in photography and in communism has its root there, because in Montessori nursery, they used to take photographs of children's furniture, of children
right.
playing. They used to observe children playing. They had special furniture made for them. It was all very airy and white and modern. And of course, the teaching methods were very progressive. And the young women who taught with Edith were also communists. She was, as a young teenager, she was probably, in fact, certainly, because I've interviewed sort of descendants or friends of hers,
Mm,
she was in the Social Democratic youth movement. And then probably at age 17, she became a member of the communist youth movement. So that's where it started. It was a very polarized society.
yes.
As I was saying before,
Mm,
Black Vienna and Red Vienna were really increasingly at odds with each
Yeah,
other.
and I mean, she's faced what we can see on a daily basis with the poverty, the kind of
Mm,
social deprivation that's going on in the city and the working class districts with the young
yes,
children she's working with and so on. And,
that's right.
you'd like to think that would influence everybody to have
Yes,
some compassion for it, but she seems to have absorbed that in a
yes,
political way as well as a human way where you do care about people.
yes. No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, social justice is the one thing that she was very, very passionate about. I mean, her family members still remember how intensely agitated she became every time that there was talk of some injustice or poverty, and this started in the streets of Vienna. I mean, one thing that I mention in the book is this extraordinary photographic record that her father published when she was about 10 years old.
Right.
In English, it's called Housing Misery in Vienna, by a left-wing journalist called Bruno Frey. And thanks to her father and her uncle, Bruno Frey contacted two amateur photographers who went to take pictures of the most appalling housing conditions of
Mm.
the poor people of Vienna. It was mainly Jewish people. It really was a revolutionary book. And I'm sure that those were the first images that impressed the importance of social justice in Edith. And then, of course, there was their experience in the nursery in this very working class district. But that was certainly, you're absolutely right, that was certainly the one thing that she fought for all her life, social justice. And children and women
Mm.
were two of her favorite themes in her photographs. You know, she was always concerned about the plight of women and children.
Yeah. Let's talk about the photography a little bit then. We're sort of splitting things up into sections of her life, and I think it's important to give people this. But what we'll get to at the end, I think, is how interconnected all these things actually are.
Yes.
It's photographs as social critique. She's looking at society and feeling things from society through that. So tell us a little bit about her love of photography and how that developed. She clearly had a talent for it because if you look at the
Mm.
photographs, well, I suppose in one sense, you know that if you'd taken the same photograph, it wouldn't have the same impact. So somehow she had that photographer's eye. And she
Yes,
was also at Bauhaus for a while, wasn't she? So,
that's right. Yes, she studied at the Bauhaus in 1929, 1930, at a time when the director of the Bauhaus was a communist called Hannes Meyer. So it was a particularly
right.
political time. But also from an aesthetic point of view, the Bauhaus influenced her photography. What is interesting about Edith Tudor Hart is that her photography really is a perfect balance between social realism and modernism.
Mm,
She's not a radical modernist,
hmm.
but her very realistic images of children, of urban situations, of political demonstrations and so on the one hand, very faithful to reality. They sort of documentary photography, but at the same time, they made arresting, interesting, different
Yes.
by unexpected framing, for example, or she liked, for example, to take photographs from up high. She liked to take pictures just before evening when the sun was setting so that she could create longer shadows.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there are certain camera angles, lighting, and unexpected framing that show the fact that she was really a Bauhaus photographer as well as a political photographer in the tradition of the Soviet worker photography, which was a movement that she embraced in Vienna in the late 20s, and also that she actively sort of promoted because she was part of the worker photographers collective, both in Vienna and then in London as well. And that was a movement that was promoted by Russia originally, and then by Willy Münzenberg in the Comintern, to document the life of the proletariat in a sort of faithful way
Yeah.
without
And actually
romanticizing.
crucial in terms of history, when we want to look back, it provides a phenomenal record of that period that we wouldn't otherwise have.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
The
And
other
it's
thing about this is,
yeah.
in a more general terms, of course, she comes to Britain, and when she comes to Britain, the first time in the middle of the 1920s, she sees the
Mm,
general strike. So she's always faced with these social conditions, and it becomes a part of the photography too. But this
yeah.
becomes a career for her. This could have been somebody's whole life, as in terms of work, to have
Yeah.
this career because she has exhibitions, she works
Yeah.
regularly for all sorts of publications,
Mm.
always with this social theme in mind. But it's a proper career, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, it is. Are you saying that she could have done without the politics and just become a famous
I
photographer?
wonder, yes, that there are so many facets to this woman's life. But if you'd said, well, could she just have been a photographer or could she have been a famous photographer? Then,
Yeah.
I think it's a possibility.
Yes, it is. The only thing is that from the very beginning, when she decided to become a photographer and to leaving the profession as a nursery teacher, which was her intended profession,
Mm,
I think photography and politics really went hand in hand for
mm,
her. So photography became a weapon for, in the fight for social justice
yeah,
and in the end for the communist revolution. Um, so the image and the idea is always at one in her
yes,
photographs from the very beginning. So much so that when at the end of her life she gives up photography, or rather she gives up politics, she gives up photography as well. Um, so her photographs, they're not didactic.
no, but
They
they are
very,
core to that social justice, that
yes,
core of her as a person.
yes.
Yeah,
So social housing,
mm,
hospitals, women welfare, child welfare, education,
yeah,
schools. That's what she photographed. And if this sounds a bit dry or sad, it really is not, because the one thing that makes her a very great photographer is the fact that she's always very human. She's
yes,
never sentimental. And she has really a special gift, which is that of being able to communicate with her subjects. You can tell that they like her, that they accept her. She's not exploiting their
yeah.
poverty or their, living conditions. She's always very respectful.
Yeah,
And
and it might be something that we don't appreciate as much now as maybe we should. But photography is an important part of change and social change.
yes,
It comes through people seeing the photographs, just as it comes through them reading the newspaper articles.
yes.
So
And
it was very important, particularly at that time, for that kind of coverage too. What
yes.
about then when she meets Alexander Tudor Hart? Tell us about
Mm.
that.
Well, she meets him very early on. She was probably 16 years old. She came to London to study with Maria Montessori in the summer
Hmm.
of 1925. And she meets Alexander's sister, Beatrice Tudor Hart. She was slightly older than Edith, was a student at Newnham in Cambridge, a very emancipated, liberated young woman. And she was also interested in child education. She went on to found a school in London. Um, she then went to Vienna to study with some psychologists
Hmm.
and educators. So um, she and Edith had a lot in common. The encounter with the Tudor Harts was probably a revelation for Edith, because they were upper class, but they were quite bohemian. This was a feature of some of the communists at the time, a little bit like Philby's family,
Yes,
Kim
right.
Philby's family, this sort of in between being upper class, but at the same time with sort of artistic tendencies and bohemian background. And they knew, I mean, both Beatrix and Alexander studied at Cambridge. Alexander was older. He was 7 years older than Edith. He had studied with Maynard Keynes in
Mm.
economics in Cambridge, and he was just embarking then in a career as a medical doctor when she met him. So he was a lot older. But in one letter years later, Edith wrote that she has to thank Alexander for her becoming a communist. And so I think that he impressed her with his sort of enthusiasm. He was already a communist then. And he was a little bit of he was very talented in what he did, especially as a doctor later on, but he was slightly naive and chaotic as a person, but certainly, good looking and charismatic. So these siblings made an impression on Edith, and they were, they had quite an extraordinary social circle. They knew Bertrand Russell and his wife, who were opening a progressive school in those same years. Beatrix was working for them. They knew the Pritchards, who were a couple, Molly and Jack Pritchard, a couple who were living in Hampstead. All very liberated, free love, progressive ideas.
No, there must have been some
left-wing.
absolutely fascinating. I mean, it sort of trivializes it to say dinner parties, but the
Yes,
social circle and the discussions that they must have had around politics. I mean, it would have been a truly
that's right.
fascinating thing to be part of, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes. And I think equally Edith must have impressed them,
Mm.
because although she was very young, 2 years later, she started working for Bob Stewart, who was, one of the founding members of the British Communist
British
Party
Communist Party.
and in charge of the secret arm of the party. And she worked for him at a time when women in the Communist Party, the British Communist Party, were 14%.
Mm.
So, she was so young. She was 18. She really had something, some sort of authority, determination, energy, and this extremely wide social circle, both in Vienna and in London, because in London she made friends with the Tudor Harts and their friends, and they went to Vienna. Beatrix went to Vienna to study in 1927, and Edith kept coming back to London every year. She came back to London until she moved here, and probably around 1929 she started an affair with Alexander,
Right.
and soon they moved in together.
And married, of course.
Yes,
That's really fascinating. I want to talk about Alexander in one sense, I think, because we've talked about Edith now. So this is a woman
yes,
who's got a photography career. This is a woman who works for the Communist Party and has this political thing going on. I also got a sense from the book that she carried Alexander a little bit in the
yeah,
sense that she did his accounts sometimes, and then she straightened him out when he was a bit feckless. He wasn't really
yes,
the most solid person, was he?
yes. No, he really wasn't. And I quite like Alexander. I didn't want to be too negative about him.
No, no.
Um, but obviously, even the MI5 agents who were shadowing them both were saying, when she was a very young woman, that she was much more solid and much more dangerous than he was as a communist. He
Mm,
was active as a communist, but um, a little bit inconclusive. And then a couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk at the Isokun Gallery in Lawn Road,
right.
where Edith had been active in the 1930s, and one of Alexander's relatives was in the audience, and his granddaughter, in fact, and she loved him. She thought he was wonderful, but he
Hmm.
was completely chaotic. He said, oh, he had three wives and various affairs, and she said that all his wives and partners were quite despairing because he was all over the place. He was always going away somewhere,
Yeah.
moving, having a child with one woman, then with another. Um, so yes, it wasn't going to last with Edith.
No, unfortunately not. But it did. Again, it points out that this woman worked so hard, in its social life
Yes,
as well as everything else. Um, let's talk about that bit that everybody will know, of course, which is well, let's talk about Arnold Deutsch to start with, the relationship with Arnold Deutsch, and that takes us to Philby. Let's listen a
Yes.
little bit about that, please.
Yes, well, Arnold Deutsch was one of the so-called great illegals. So, in the early days of the Stalinist regime, there were special agents who were, for the most part, not Russians. They were Central Europeans, very cultured, multilingual,
Yeah.
clever men, and who were agents for Stalin. Um, and Arnold Deutsch was one of them. He was of Czech origins, but grew up and studied in Vienna, a very cultured man, um, extremely charismatic, and almost certainly, a regular customer at the Sushitsky bookshop.
Hmm.
His wife, the woman, the communist who became his wife, called Fini Rubel, she was teaching at the same nursery as Edith. The year after Edith left, she started teaching there. So she
Right.
was part of this, they were part of this sort of communist, a circle of young communists,
Mm.
very active communist. The Communist Party in Austria, as in Britain, in fact, was tiny, but its links with Russia, with Soviet Russia, meant that it was quite effective. And Arnold Deutsch, not only was he recruiting agents, but he also had in Vienna he was forging passports.
Right.
Uh, so some say that he gave Edith her first camera and told her, explained to her how important photography was. I'm not sure, we don't know for sure,
No,
but
you make that clear in the book. It's
yes, yes. But he was, again, someone who was extremely active and one of the most talented agents that Stalin had at the time. So they met in Vienna, they were part of the same circle. In the same circle was also a friend of Edith called Lizzie Coleman,
right.
Alice Coleman, who was recruited by Edith, um, recruited perhaps to start with for Comintern work, and then later on as an NKVD spy, for
Right.
the secret services. So Arnold Deutsch was a central figure in Edith's political, in the development of a political consciousness. And what is crucial is that in 1934, in the spring of 1934, when Edith was living as Alexander's wife in London, Arnold Deutsch arrived in London.
Right.
And that sort of has important consequences that we'll perhaps talk about.
It certainly does, because this introduces Philby into the picture and what happens with the origins of the Cambridge Five.
Yes, yes. Well, um, in the book, I mean, it is a well-known fact that Edith recruited Kim Philby, or helped to recruit Kim Philby.
Yes.
She passed on his name to Arnold Deutsch, and famously, as the story goes, took him to the park bench in Regent's Park in late spring of 1934 and introduced him to Otto. That was the code
Oh,
name
no.
of Arnold Deutsch.
Yeah. And Philby was Zornstein.
Yes, that's right,
Funny.
Zontin. Yes, yes, that was his code name. I'm sure this happened. There is the possibility that Philby and Deutsch met in Vienna. I did look at the dates in the archives of when Philby was in Vienna exactly. Um, Anthony Blunt, when he was interrogated in 1964, he did hint at the fact that Edith might even have recruited Philby in Cambridge
Hmm.
in 1933. Another historian, Helen Fry, suspects, in fact, that Philby was an SIS agent in Vienna in 1933-34. So there are different
Yeah.
angles to this very famous story, but it is almost certainly true that Edith convinced Deutsch to recruit Philby. And this really started in Vienna in the early 30s, because one preoccupation of Edith's political activities in Vienna was that in Austria at the time, the universities were full of right-wing students. That the Nazis were doing very well in Vienna's universities, and she was concerned. It was not just the workers that she wanted to convert to communism, but she thought, and Arnold Deutsch thought, that it was more important to mobilize the students. And there is one letter to Alexander that Edith writes from Vienna saying, it's not much good if the students are communists and active in Cambridge and they just limited to their privileged college life.
Yes,
they need to be activated in the real world. And so this was very much an idea that Edith and Arnold Deutsch concocted together. There is even a letter by Bob Stewart, the Communist Party member, to Harry Pollitt, who was the leader of the party, saying, don't worry about the students. I can't remember whether I think he mentions Edith, but he's saying we have this in hand.
It covered.
Yeah, we have it covered. And so, the plan obviously worked.
Yeah, well, it absolutely did. And of course, we know the consequences, which they can't have guessed at themselves at the time, but we know where that went.
Yes.
But it is interesting. That's the sort of thing that everybody's going to pin, who knows very little about Edith. That's where they'll pin Edith to the story of the 20th century. And it's a small part of her story overall.
Yes.
Although it's incredibly significant, of course. I wouldn't want to underestimate that.
Yes.
But she has her own work, as you pointed out, something you said before, and it's interesting to maybe explain to people a little bit, is the Communist Party of Great Britain and the secret side of the Communist Party of Great Britain.
Yes.
And then something about the work that she was doing herself, which carried on for decades afterwards, not related to Philby or Maclean or any of the others.
No. Yes. Well, what is interesting, before we get on to that, is that she's known as Philby's recruiter. Actually, I mean, we should say that Philby married her friend Litzy.
Yeah.
And Litzy and Edith were really two of the most important agents that both the Communist Party of Great Britain and Stalin had in Britain. But what is interesting is that Edith never had anything to do with the Cambridge Five. She probably she certainly frequented Philby and Litzy between 1934 and 1937, when Philby went to Spain and Litzy went to Paris. But she really was not.
No, that was simple social contact.
With the social, whereas Litzy was a very good friend of Guy Burgess. She used to frequent 5 Benting Street during the war, which was the house where Burgess and Blunt lived, and there were sort of parties with various British upper class students and so on. Edith was never part of that circle at all. She was much more involved with the emigres. She lived at that time in the 30s. She lived in Hampstead, and she was politically involved secretly with the party. You asked me about the secret arm of the party, and this goes back to the legal and illegal side of the of the communist movement. I think it started.
These illegals being the agents who work outside of the embassy, not directly for the NKVD,
without diplomatic cover, and so secret. And the same was with the party. And this Bob Stewart was in charge of the secret arm of the party. And Edith worked for him. And for a time in the late 30s, for example, when the Russians, for various reasons, various blunders, including the Great Terror in Russia at the time, did not have illegals working for them. It was Edith and Litzy who were passing on messages to Bob Stewart. Guy Burgess was passing messages to Litzy. Litzy was passing them to Edith, and Edith was the only person who could contact Bob Stewart. So there was this sort of secret work for the party. And whereas, for example, Alexander was a very active communist member, he used to go to demonstrations and help in the medical units.
Yeah,
You
not
distribute.
exactly a dilettante, but a sort of a very British way of doing things, perhaps.
Yes, that's right. Distributing leaflets
Right.
and things like that. And Edith was working really undercover. She was not. They were following her, but
Yeah.
they
I think you
couldn't.
point out in the book that she had a strategic role in
Yes,
running the
she
secret
did.
party, if you like.
Mm. Well, she did because of something else that I've already mentioned. The fact that she knew so many people, she was so well connected.
Mm.
And in fact, MI5, in one of the files, it said that they put her in a special category because she knew so many people. I think they said she had her fingers in so many pies. And that is fascinating about her. She knew people from the party. She
Mm.
knew a lot of emigres. She knew a lot of artists. She was friends with architects and photographers, psychoanalysts. It was really even her brother said that her house was a center of people coming across. There were.
I suppose maybe because of her own experience, she was also very important in welcoming refugees to the UK, wasn't she, or to Britain?
Yes, yes, she was, because she arrived in London. So she moved to London with Alexander in the autumn, the end of the summer of 1933. So at that time, Hitler had been in power for 6 months,
Mm.
and there weren't that many emigres. But from the end of 1933 and then 1934 onwards, and then increasingly after the Nuremberg laws, and then decisively after Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass in
Yes. Yeah.
1938, thousands of emigres started to arrive. But at that initial stage, where it was mostly political refugees who were coming to London, she was one of the main ports of call for a lot of them
You
from
mentioned
Austria
that,
and
and as we
Germany.
approach as the war when it comes to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and what goes
Yes.
on with the Nazis and the Soviet Union actually getting together. What was that period like for her? Because the illegals did withdraw. We had a more autonomy, I suppose, in a sense, people in Britain. I'm
Yes.
just curious about Edith's reaction to that.
Well, again, we don't know her reaction.
Mm.
Most of the people around her were shocked by the
Mm.
Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The thing about Edith is that she was incredibly loyal.
Mm.
I think she was a
Right.
loyal communist for a long time. And one clue that we have is her lover at the time, who is a very interesting man, Austrian communist called Martin Harnik, who was sort of quite a high-ranking communist, came to London. And in 1930, in the autumn of 1939, so a few months after the pact, he gave a speech at the Austrian Centre, which was founded in London for Austrian refugees, which was a little bit of a sort of communist center. He gave a speech defending the
Yeah.
Soviet
Mm.
pact, and Edith was very close to Martin Ornik. So we also know from the files from Moles, who sort of revealed what was said during the communist meetings at the time, that a lot of the comrades were cynical about what was happening in Russia
Hmm.
and critical, secretly critical, but they had to support it no matter what. And I think that's what she did. She did support it, so much so that then from the end of 1942 for about 2 years, she was involved in atomic espionage. So she
Yes,
certainly
right. And this is what
kept
brings us to
supporting.
Cairncross
Yeah,
and a
yes.
few other scandals that were going on at the time. And of course, all this time she's under investigation. Just at the Second World War, with when the Holocaust became known, fully known and public. What was
Yes.
that like for her? Because I mean, it was
It,
personal with the family, of course.
yes, yes, because part of her family had aunt and uncle had escaped with one of their daughters to France. And in 1942, they'd been captured, taken to
Mm.
Drancy, the French camp, and then to Auschwitz, where they perished. Her cousin Carla, who was the cousin who was closest to her, survived with her daughter, hiding in France. Other family members perished. Another cousin from Vienna was taken to another Polish ghetto. The brother of a sister-in-law of Wolfgang Suschitzky's wife also perished in a camp. They probably learnt about it. I mean, they didn't know about the aunt and uncle.
Mm-hmm.
This became known later on. They disappeared, of course, but and also there were two cousins, Wilhelm and Willy and Pepi, who had been imprisoned in 1938 in Vienna, and they'd been taken to Dachau and to Buchenwald, where they had to endure terrible things. Somehow through the either the Labour Party or the TUC, they managed to come to London in 1939, and they opened a bookshop, and they became established as quite famous booksellers. But they had endured terrible suffering, of which they did not speak. But I think in 1945, 46, this was certainly something that was felt within the family. I mean, the cousins had also been interned as enemy aliens, so it wasn't easy for them. And I should also say that Wolfgang Suschitzky had been married early on. In 1934, he had married a Dutch communist and had moved to Amsterdam for a year. Then they separated and he came back to London and married someone else. But Edith had trained this young Dutch communist and had put her in touch with the Russians. And after the war, this woman called Puk Wute came to visit the Suschitzkys in 1946 and told them what she had witnessed in Amsterdam. So that was certainly a difficult time for them.
And I mean, it just is general that there were a lot of tragedies in her life. You know, there's a tough life. And I mean, one of the other things was she was bombed out during the Second World War.
Yes.
Came home one night to find her house wasn't there anymore.
It was, yes, a studio which was opposite Selfridges in Mayfair had been bombed. And what she called the great tragedy of her life was her son, much loved son, Tommy, who had been born in 1936, and who, by the age of 4, had started showing signs of either autism, probably what we today would define as a sort of severe form of autism.
Yeah.
And at the time, it's been diagnosed as schizophrenic. By this time, she was a single mother. She had no money, very little money, because Alexander never really supported her.
No.
And she was supporting herself and this young boy, taking him to see Anna Freud, taking him to various clinics. This went on till the end of her life.
Yeah, you can get a sense of the desperation in her life because she is trying to still earn a living. As you say, she's not being supported, so she's got to keep the photography going and everything. But she's looking for clinics to find, people who can help, genuinely help with her son.
Yes.
Rather than, you can imagine some of the attitudes there might have been at that time. Just
that's right.
Up, put them away somewhere, hope nobody looks,
Yes, yes.
And of course, she fought against that with her love of children and
education
that had come from early on.
She did. And this is also clear in her photographs from when Tommy is born. She starts taking pictures of him. And he does become the face of her campaigns in many ways, both commercial campaigns that she was doing to earn money. He was a very good-looking child, and she took wonderful photographs of him, some of which, ended up, publicizing Boots or baby soap or baby food and so on. But also then the Spanish Civil War, or the cover of Picture Post in August of 1945 after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The cover of Picture Post had a young Tommy Tudor Hart on an empty beach. So even her photography changed somewhat after, with Tommy, and her interest in children increased, and she did photograph schools for disabled children.
There's a fascinating photograph in the book, actually. I've been talking to somebody else who'd written a fictional book about the South London Women and Children's Hospital.
Oh, I think I heard it. Yes.
Right. Julie Anderson.
Julie Anderson, that's
Yeah.
right.
And I
Yes,
had no idea of that hospital until have read her book and I found it. And you've got a
yes,
photograph of
yes,
Edith that Edith has taken, rather, of some children going through some ultra process, what's it, ultra
that's
ray
right. No,
treatment.
I heard your interview with Julie Anderson, and was very interested about that coincidence, because Edith was, I think it was 1935. 35 or 36, one of her commissions was to take photographs for a booklet, a pamphlet about the
Mm,
South London Hospital for Women and Children, which was a sort of something that she was probably very interested in, also the philanthropic
I'm
aspect.
sure she was. I mean, the fact that this is a hospital run by women, completely run,
That's
administrators,
right. Yes,
surgeons, all women,
yes. And
remarkable.
she took some wonderful photographs. I found the original booklet in one of the London archives,
Right.
and the photograph that's in the book was not included in the booklet, but there are some other wonderful photographs, both of the women, of the patients in the waiting room, and
Mm,
women doctors, and especially of the children. There is this sort of wonderful contrast between the children's helplessness and the new technology,
yes.
of the
Yeah.
infrared lamps and ultraviolet lamps, and
Yeah. Fascinating.
it's they really very impressive photographs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you do have examples of the photograph in the book. They should get some sense
Yes,
of her photography a little bit across her career when they see that.
yes.
One of the other aspects of this, and you did mention it earlier, but I think it's worth focusing on a little bit, is the surveillance in her life. I
Mm,
wonder how many people would consider what it would be like to have surveillance from
yes.
the time you leave your teens right the way through. I think our last interview is not that long before she actually dies.
No. Yes. In
The
fact,
last time she's hauled in by MI5.
yes, that I've discovered in the files that were released in January of 2025. So I'd nearly
Right.
finished the book, and the it was files. I think that was in Litzy Philby's file.
Mm,
Uh, then there was Anthony Blunt's file and John Cairncross. But in Litzy Philby's file, there is this extraordinary interview with Edith in 1968 with MI5, with Arthur Martin, Peter Wright, who interviewed her. And one really does get the sense of what she was like, of her authority, but also of the fear she had lived with all these years. She was
yeah.
terrified.
Yeah.
And I mean, she's been, even in the MI5 files, they talk about her fear of persecution, of the fact that in 1952, after she was interviewed about Philby, she had a nervous breakdown.
Mm,
And they did portray her as this sort of hysterical, unbalanced woman. But it was no surprise, that she
no,
was,
absolutely.
I mean, she lived with this constant surveillance. She could not trust the people around her because, some of them turned out to be moles.
Yeah.
She was really terrified, and during and after her nervous breakdown in the 1950s, when she then withdrew from politics and
Mm,
left London and moved to Brighton, a lot of people I interviewed said she was paranoid. And again, the other night at the Isokon Gallery, Alexander's granddaughter remembered that her mother, who was a friend of Edith, always dreaded her visits in the 1950s
right.
because Edith was always complaining about being followed. I didn't know this when I was writing the book, but it makes sense. She
Yes,
was
it does make sense.
very, very disturbed
Yeah.
by what she'd
Makes you think
been.
of that phrase they used as well, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not after you. You know,
That's right.
I
Yes.
think in Edith's case, they probably were. But
Yeah.
no, I think that's a sad aspect of her life. But
Mm.
when you'd finished then, because now you've done all this research, you've written the book,
Yes.
did you have a different impression of the woman, or was it just that it more confirmed some of the things you believed about her?
Well, I got to know her much better, I think. I hope I convey this in the book. I didn't want to speculate in the book, so
Yeah.
there is quite a lot of probablys, might have been, it's likely that, and all that. I certainly felt by the end of it that I knew her much better. And my overall impression, despite the fact that it was a terribly sad life, considering also all the great hopes in her youth
Mm,
and how promising and talented she was, despite the fact that she'd been very unlucky and that her life had been really quite tragic in many ways, I ended the book with the sense of a woman who was still full of authority. And even her work in Brighton as an antique dealer,
mm,
I talked to her niece who remembers how well liked and how respected she was by the other antique dealers. Anything she did well.
yeah,
And so yes, I ended with a more rounded impression of her and of somebody who was very talented with a very strong character, uh, perhaps overly intense, but certainly someone who, was quite special.
absolutely. And I think, it's quite clear she was a very intelligent woman. But one of
Yes.
the things that strikes me is, and I don't know, see what you think. It's just that I think if she'd been a man, she'd have been more
Mm,
keen on making what she was doing public, or more keen on somehow stealing the limelight. Whereas
yes.
Edith doesn't seem to care about that. She wants
No.
to do the job and she gets on with it, and she
Yeah.
isn't really interested in anything else.
No, not at all. I think one quality that she had was a extraordinary generosity.
Mm,
So she was very generous. She was a very good friend to her friends. Um, so I think it was more privately that it was clear that she shined. But she certainly didn't boast or a little bit the 1950s when she was so worried, she was so paranoid about being
mm,
followed, being discovered, being expelled. She was terrified of being expelled um, from the country like she had been once at the
yeah,
beginning of the
yeah.
30s. But one thing that she did thinking back was that she had been naive and she said something like we there was all this lovely excitement, we were all romantics, and this is quite interesting because it's a feature. I think even Kim Philby says that, thinking back, and the other day I was reading a book, I think it's by Sean Walker, about the illegals.
Right.
And he says that even today the old KGB spies think back to the old days thinking, oh, it was all so romantic. And it's, to think about it now, we would think is as terrifying. But to them, they were real, you know, they were so idealistic that their youth seemed, a sort of golden age. And at the time, she said that she was indiscreet, that she was
Mm.
telling, there's one phrase that she says, I was telling everybody in the street corner.
Having
uh,
said that, though, I mean, if they could have pinned something on her, if they could have found a
yes,
way of deporting her or charging her as a traitor when she married Alexander, they never
yeah,
did.
they never did. No,
So,
but
in
that's,
all the times they took her in and interrogated her, I mean, as
yeah,
far as I know, the only thing I think you say in the book is that in the end, she did make a confession about spying in Austria and Italy,
yes, she
and that's
did.
it.
That's it. Yes, during the long, and even then, that was in 1947, and it's not. I'm not even sure that that was an interrogation.
Mm.
So I don't know. She might have said that to somebody who then referred
Right,
it
I
to the
get you.
agents, because there is. It does count as her second interrogation, but I could find no evidence that she'd
Mm.
actually been interrogated. And considering the fact that after every interrogation she was very nervous and unhappy and terrified, after that statement in 1947, she just kept working for the party as if nothing had happened. So I don't know what it was, but she did admit to working for the Russians. Um, but otherwise, she was really unbreakable.
What about her legacy then? I think some people will obviously connect her to the Cambridge Five. You know, they were connected to this
Mm,
the thing with Philby, and that will forever be the one thing that they know about her. But I
yes.
mean, in terms of her photography, for instance, what do you think her legacy is now? Now,
Well,
now
I
that we're
think
starting to learn more, of course, because there also weren't many books on Edith. I've noticed that there was some of the photography. You can find books of her photography. That's been
yes,
around.
now, I mean, last year, as I say in my, at the end of the book, last year alone, three books on Edith's photography came out.
Right.
It was an important exhibition in Salzburg. There is an exhibition of Edith's photographs now in Berlin, in a gallery in Berlin. And the Bauhaus in Berlin is about to open an exhibition about Bauhaus women photographers, and Edith is included. And there was an exhibition 2 years ago up until last year at the Isokun Gallery, and there is a book published by the Isokun Gallery about her and her photographs. And then there is still Duncan Forbes' catalogue,
Hmm.
2013 catalogue, In the Shadow of Tyranny, with her photographs. Another book entitled Poverty for Sale, published in Edinburgh 2 years ago, with some wonderful reproductions and some articles about her photography. I think that's where her legacy lies, um, in terms of sort of artistic
Hmm. Yeah.
output. I also think her life itself, I mean, she will forever be connected to the Cambridge Five. But what I find quite extraordinary is this life lived fully in history from when she was very, very young. She really was someone who lived through history, like very few people I've encountered, whether one agrees with her ideas or not.
Yeah.
Someone during
Yeah.
a talk I gave a few weeks ago asked me if she had blood on her hands, and perhaps she does, like the Cambridge Five do. But her intentions were certainly good ones, and her photographs show this. They're really very, very impressive images, and they don't age. When we
Mm.
look at her photographs, we immediately connect with them, with the people in them, um,
Yeah,
with the
absolutely. We
aesthetic
do.
value as well.
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
and she did mean well. I mean, there was certainly a fanatical streak in her, and as I said before, she could be so intense about the things she believed in. And although towards the end of her life she did abandon her political activities, and from 1953 onwards she was no longer a member of the Communist Party, and she was quite disappointed, to say the least, by the way the party sort of dropped her
She
when she
became a very
went.
isolated figure, didn't
Very,
she?
very. She isolated herself.
Mm.
Yes, I found a letter written by a friend of hers to her cousin, and I quote this in the book. The friend says that she doesn't understand how from one day to the next Edith was suddenly a different person.
Mm.
So she isolated herself, and then she does say in that long MI5 interview in 1968 that she didn't want to be a burden to her friends and family, because she was so worried about her son. She was so paranoid about her persecution,
Mm.
that she just wouldn't talk about anything else. And so she preferred to isolate herself. But
Which,
even
as you say,
so,
whatever you think, that's pretty selfless.
Yes, it is. And also in isolating herself, she wasn't idle. She opened a little shop, antique shop. She became an
Mm.
expert collector. And as I said before, she was respected by the people around her. So she was pretty remarkable, you can
Yeah,
say.
no, she does. She gives the impression of being somebody who would have, whatever she turned her hand to, she would find a way of being good at it. She'd be a
Yeah,
success.
yes. And I
Absolutely.
think some of the people I interviewed, she really comes across as one of those people whose presence is immediately strong in a
Mm.
room when they come in, and the fact that she held people, she gave advice, she offered, somewhere to sleep. She was always, even in the very small flats which she had, she always lived in small places, never had any money.
Mm.
But there were always friends coming and staying and living with her, and she was feeding them and helping. She was really selfless in many respects.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good note to leave it on. What about then, what's next? I mean, you put a
Well,
lot of time and effort into these projects, don't you?
yes. Well, I really immersed myself into this world, and I was thinking the other day how I spent last year, I spent a month and a half in Vienna, and how I loved that, just going,
Right.
from cafe to archive to cafe to hotel. Uh, and as probably biographers feel, you live with these people in your head, and it's quite difficult to let go. And now with publicizing the book, I'm still
Right. So
um,
you sort of actually need some time to decompress, if you like.
yes, a little bit. And I've given a couple of talks, and I have some more coming, and I don't want to say the same things in every talk, so I'm trying to find different angles to concentrate on.
Right.
But I'm keen to start something new. It's just that I don't quite know what I'm going to do. I have two, three projects. Some might have to do with Italy,
Right.
uh, but and probably connected to women, or another biography of a
Okay.
woman, perhaps a writer this time. But I can't say yet
No,
because
no, fair enough. No, no, I won't push you. And, one of them's going to take your fancy at some point, isn't it? Or one of those projects is going to be the one
yes,
that grabs you and you think, right, this is what I'm
yes.
doing, definitely.
It's also to think of something that is interesting to a British audience.
Right.
I think I'm often attracted to sort of niche subjects, but then the book wouldn't sell. So I have to think
Yeah, I
carefully.
do see what you mean. I mean, I suppose the point is that this is a very personal biography because it's about all aspects of Edith's life.
Yes,
But at the same time, as you pointed out, she's a woman of the 20th century, and you can trace a lot of what happened in the 20th century
that's right.
to her
Yeah,
life and what's going
yeah,
on, around her. So I suppose but I suppose every little story kind of fits into that pattern somewhere along the line.
yes.
It's
I
just
think that
making people understand where the connections are. Maybe that's the point.
yes, no, that's true. I mean, with Edith Tudor Hart, it was quite easy because
Yes,
the spy angle is obviously attractive to a wider audience. Um, I'm not sure I would have been commissioned this book if she'd only been a photographer. I don't know. I'll have
yeah.
to
Well, it would
say.
have been a different audience, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, yes. But no, I'm thinking of other things because I love the research process, possibly more than the writing.
Right.
So, and the
Fine.
reading around it, reading about London in the 40s and 50s and Vienna, and
Did
that's
you did you have a problem then in actually sort of saying, right, I've done enough research. I really do have to write.
yes. And I had to leave.
Right.
I made, because I wanted it to be chronological and I wanted to put all the facts together as accurately as possible. I
Mm,
made this long timelines for each chapters, what was happening in a certain year, what was
I see. Mm,
in her file, and then comparing that with what was happening in the files about her friends, and then the ones about the Communist Party, and then
right.
I would read the newspaper of that particular year and comparing all these details, what the weather was like, what the building would have been like. So yes, it was a little bit mad. And then I had to leave a lot out, so as to make it a pleasant reading experience.
Yeah, I think that you can carry that essence, though, isn't it? You pick up so much stuff that you then can't use, but at the same time, it does sort of still infuse the story. It does still
Yes,
carry, yeah. So it's
yes.
not wasted time anyway. That's the
No,
point.
no, it
And if
didn't
you
feel
enjoy
like
it,
a waste
well,
of time. Yes, and no, and then the writing is quite purifying in a way, because you sort of distill
mm,
what is important. So no, it was great, and reading other things around it was also great. I learned a lot, because this was really not my field at all originally. So I learned a lot of new
no, which
stuff.
is always fascinating. Yeah. So one
Yeah,
good thing about doing something historical is that you can get into any area of it. So,
that's
I
right.
mean, psychology or the films of the day or the books of the
Yes,
day or what the streets were like, the fashion, it doesn't matter what it is. So much stuff.
absolutely. Yes, yes. I have, in fact, behind me an old A to Z of London
I
to
noticed.
yes,
I
to
pay
see.
attention to people's bookshelves.
And and the the tube, the 1934 tube map, to know
Right.
where she would have, what line she would have taken, and so
Right.
on.
Yes.
Yes, no, I just love all that. And so yes, the next project will be something similar, but about almost
Something else.
certainly a different, probably even a
I'm not
different
going to
country.
push. I'm not going to push.
No, we'll
Daria,
see.
I've really enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
I have, Paul. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Quite an insight into Edith Tudor Hart. If you are interested in buying A Woman Named Edith by Daria Santini, you can get it from all good book outlets. If you click the link on the program notes, you can get it from us. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and subscribe with your favourite podcast provider. That really does help us to continue to bring you these interviews. And of course, I'll be back with another interview very shortly. But in the meantime, bye, and thank you very much for listening.